Hello and a warm welcome to all the viewers who have subscribed to my YouTube station, Smitasharma Journalist. This is episode 3 of the Foreign Policy Dialogue, where I'm trying to do some deep dive conversations on issues that perhaps may or may not be in the headlines as far as international relations are concerned, but it's important to have an understanding of those issues. And in this episode today, we are going to talk about the neighboring country of Myanmar, because the situation there has been extremely worrisome, going from bad to worse. Of course, Myanmar saw the toppling of a democratically elected government in 2021. The military junta took over. The country is no stranger when it comes to military rules and regimes. But in the last few weeks and months, we have seen large swaths of territory that the junta has lost to rebel forces. There is large-scale violence also that continues to be reported against innocent civilians. And it's important to keep an eye out there because obviously India shares almost 1,600 kilometers long border with Myanmar, and whatever happens in Myanmar has an impact on the entire region, whether it's India, whether it's Bangladesh. So to talk about Myanmar, to understand the story there, I have Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya, who's also served there as India's envoy, retired career diplomat, served in senior positions. Thank you so much for finding time to have this conversation.
Pleasure, Smita, to be with you.
If I could begin by asking you to explain to our interested audiences today of really how much control does the military junta have in Myanmar currently? I mean, when we are looking at Chin, when we are looking at Rakhine, how much territorial loss has also happened to the junta?
Yeah, so, there's a little difference between territory and population. But by and large, if we look at the trajectory over the last 4 years, and in less than a month, we'll actually be 4 years of the military coup, what you will find is a steady slide, starting from the beginning when the struggle really was literally with sticks and stones and flintlock rifles, to a situation today where estimates are anything up to 75% of territory is highly contested, if not lost. Not necessarily that doesn't translate into population, because the larger population centers are still with the SAC government. But if we look at one sort of good metric, which is the townships, there are 330 townships. About 90 of them are now considered to be fully with the junta. Another 150 to 180 are either besieged or contested, highly contested. And only about another third, maybe, or even a quarter, maybe with the junta firmly. So that's what we are talking about. But in addition to the administrative control, which we are discussing now, the junta has lost a lot of military ground. So in the last 5 months, starting from August, they have lost 2 regional military commands. The Northeast Regional Military Command stationed in Lashio, a very strategic point between China and Mandalay on the highway, and the second one, which they lost on December 20, which was the Western Regional Military Command at An, which is in Rakhine State. So that now I think there are a little over 10 regional military commands, but this is the first time in Myanmar's history where they have lost as many military commands and as much administrative control over territory as so far. And I think more than anything else, it's also the steady trajectory of losses, because in fact at different times the military junta has tried to stage offensives to recover territory, but most of those efforts have been mostly infructuous. In fact, there's hardly any recovery of territory. Even with Chinese help to try and dislodge the MNDAA from Lashio, it has not worked. So overall, what we are seeing is a steady loss of territory, steady loss of administrative control, and the junta's military is also being consistently degraded. Degraded by desertions, degraded by losses, degraded by attrition. They have resorted to forced conscription. Essentially, their ground troops are in very bad state, and as a result, they are taking increasing recourse to aerial bombardments, aerial attacks, and also artillery, and of course, scorched earth policies, arson, burning of villages and houses, and so on. Essentially, extremely destructive, basically trying to punish the people, punish the public for the actions of the armed opposition and the ethnic resistance groups. And so the overall picture is one of loss, not gain, even with some amount of political help from the Chinese that we can discuss.
Right. Yes, we will talk about the role of China in the region also, but the fact also does remain that China has been the largest supplier of arms, consistent supplier of arms for Myanmar. Having said that, tell us a little bit more about the opposition forces, the armed opposition forces, the Three Brotherhood Alliance. Where are they gaining in their resources from?
Right. So, thank you, Smita. There are two parts. I will answer this in two parts. One is as far as the opposition is concerned. Now, as you know, Myanmar has really never been in true peace since the time of its independence. Even as it got its independence, there was a major Karen insurgency that was brewing in the south at that time, which had almost reached as far as Rangoon. But over the last 70 years, what we have seen is they've had the numbers have fluctuated, but let's say we take a figure of roughly 16 major ethnic armed groups, each fighting their own separate battle against the center originally at Yangon and now at Naypyidaw, against the Union, through its entire history. Now, at different periods of time, they've managed to, let's say, negotiate ceasefires, and the last one was in 2015 when they negotiated the nation-wide ceasefire agreement. But around the time of the coup, by and large, there had been a dialogue process starting with the nationwide ceasefire agreement, subsequently continued in something called the Panglong II conference initiated by Aung San Suu Kyi. But the insurgencies had been on the wane. At least they were not active insurgencies. They were insurgencies that had been negotiating. What 2021 coup did, the February 1, 2021 coup did, was that it changed things completely. For one, the ethnic armed resistance groups became active once again. They became ethnic resistance organizations. They became, because they were the people experienced in battle fighting and battles, they became the trainers for a lot of the alienated youth in particular from the Burma heartland. So previously it was mainly ethnic armed insurgencies. Now you had the Burma people taking to large scale insurgencies. Mind if you didn't begin like this, because initial reaction to the coup was firstly a civil disobedience movement, secondly peaceful protests on the streets. It is only when these peaceful protests and civil disobedience movement was very harshly repressed by the military junta that particularly the youth took to the hills and took to the forests and started training to fight the military junta. And by and large this carried on. In fact, it had been losing, and this got converted in the Burma areas into a whole bunch of hundreds of PDFs, People's Defense Forces, which were all local. So they were local around a township, they were local around towns, they were local around regions. So the Chins had a Chin PDF, every town had their own PDFs. So it was literally a kind of nationwide, you can call it a mutiny against the...
They were not external forces.
No, I would say there's a great tendency on our part and many people's part to always look for an outside force, as though it's an outside force that is propelling the insurgency. So no insurgency really manages with only internal support. They always need some support from neighbors or somewhere else, whether it's in terms of safe havens or whatever. But I would say that these insurgencies, these mutinies, this armed opposition is about as local, about as national as possible. But returning to your question, so this more or less carried on until about October 2023. In October 2023, there was one major development that three major ethnic resistance organizations, the MNDAA, representing by and large the ethnic Chinese Kokang population, the TNLA, representing an ethnicity called the Palong. These were both in northern Shan state. And in Rakhine state, it was the Arakan Army, also called by various other names, but essentially a Rakhine kind of nationalistic force. They decided to coordinate a military offensive. Obviously, they had been working with it for some time. But the progress of the armed opposition, the progress in terms of territory and battles and in terms of administrative control really changed. So what we are seeing is like 14 months from October to now. As I said, the figures, there's been a sort of steep increase in their successes on the battlefield. In many areas, they have started forming their executive committees, administrative. They've even started providing some basic services, some judicial services, administrative services. But even aside from these three areas, the Kachin Independence Organization and the Kachin Independence Army, they have made great gains in Kachin state and in northern Myanmar, in Mandalay and in Sagaing. In Kaya state, the Karenni forces have gained a lot. In Kayin state, the Karens are fighting quite a lot. Bago, Tanintari, Mon, in all these places there have been steady gains. In Sagaing, they are grouped together in something called the Sagaing Forum. In Magway, they have also a putative Magway Forum. Magway is also an area which abuts on Chin state and on Rakhine state. So the thinking is that perhaps the Arakan army, now having gained almost full control of the land area of Rakhine state, minus Sitwe, a bit of Chofu and another island called Manong, that next they will press into the Irrawaddy Valley. That means Magway on the one hand, where all these ordnance factories, military industrial complexes are, and Aiwaddy province towards the south. So now, in many ways, there is a possibility that the war will move from the hill areas where China has tried to push back and enter the Burma heartland. So we are at a very interesting phase in the war, and at least I don't see the military with its degraded ground troops being able to reverse this trend.
You know, it's very interesting that at such a time when you have this kind of a civil war situation in Myanmar, you have this kind of a war situation in Myanmar, and also tens of thousands of political opponents behind bars, critiques behind bars, including Aung San Suu Kyi, of course, who faces several, in fact, allegations, and she continues to lodge behind bars. General Min Aung Hlaing, General MH, and they seem to have suggested that Myanmar will be holding elections in 2025.
Yeah.
I mean, does that look like them trying to desperately show to the world that we are in control, even if they are able to hold elections? I mean, which areas will they be able to hold elections in, and will that have even an iota of credibility in them?
So I'm rather surprised that they are, I think the Myanmar military junta has not been very politically imaginative. And so, they are very set that this 2008 constitution, it's going to go as it is. Ground realities have changed, but they seem to be unwilling to change course or look at a different approach. And the only solutions they can think of are within the 2008 constitution. They have extended, actually beyond the constitutional limits, the emergencies that they have been declaring every 6 months. And finally, they conducted a so-called census just at the end of last year by November. I doubt if they were able to conduct the census in even more than 50% of the land area. In many areas, the census takers were even unwelcome, they were attacked and so on. So now they are plan to conduct this election in November 2025 based on a census that has been taken in about half the population. So already I think it lacks credibility. And even with the backing of China, which they seem to have, I think it will be a very hard sell to the international community that these are going to be free, fair and elections, and that the outcome will be respected. In fact, as I think it will happen, as we approach the elections, subversive activity or attacks against anybody holding elections will increase. So in fact, there is a very strong likelihood that the elections itself would be
extremely
violent, jeopardized, subverted.
But I'm very tempted to ask you, Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, you mentioned the number of resistance forces on the ground, not just every province, but literally so many of them. For a country that has so many ethnic communities, it's so fragmented. When Aung San Suu Kyi had returned years ago, of course there was that slight cautious but a hope, an optimistic note that perhaps there will be some fledgling democracy that, will be on the rise. Is democracy truly possible in Myanmar amidst
Absolutely.
all the divisions and the fault lines?
Absolutely. No, so these are complex questions with no straight answers. So what you see today as the opposition is actually a mix of democratic sentiments and stirrings, and a mix of people looking for autonomy, not necessarily
secession
no, not necessarily secession at all. And in fact, if you see the kind of nascent political formations that are coming up, in fact, in many ways, I would put it like this, that there is a genuine stirring and need for a true democracy in Myanmar that is coming out, that is being forged in the course of this battle. And most of all, this is in particular in the Burma areas, because in the Burma areas, they have been seeking deeper democracy all this time against centralized rule, against military rule, and so on. And in the ethnic areas, you have a mix of the two. You have a kind of, let's say, main forces which are seeking autonomy. So they are looking more for a federal, or in the Arakan case, maybe even a confederal kind of model. Some of them are looking for a single party or a military run kind of outfit, maybe even modeled on China. But some of them are actually also looking at a more democratic apparatus. So some of these groups are grouped together under something called the NUCC, the National Union Consultative Committee, who have drafted, and this includes the NUG, who have drafted something called the Federal Union Charter. So this is the direction that Myanmar is going. It may be more federal, maybe less democratic, it may be more democratic, it's not going to be less federal for sure. The exact balance between federal, democratic and union will have to be worked out. These are being intensely debated, and I would say that there is genuinely a possibility which people don't realize and often don't give credit for. There's genuinely the possibility of a democratic federal union with Asian characteristics that represents the ethnic and cultural and linguistic and even religious diversity of countries in Asia in particular. I mean, Myanmar being a very good example of that, emanating from this. But of course, this is an uphill struggle, and they are going to need a lot of intellectual, moral, political support to be able to do this.
We will talk about the role of India and the channels of communication that India has kept open. Of course, remember, Myanmar is a country that has faced several sanctions, particularly from the US over the years, but India has always constantly maintained that, this is a country that we share such long borders with. Our northeastern states have borders with. So for us, this is about security essentially. So India has different priorities altogether, and that's why India has never cut off ties with the junta, unlike what India has done, say for instance, with Taliban in the past in Afghanistan. But coming to the role of China, and there's an interview that the UN rapporteur in an interview to NDTV recently said that the opposition National Unity Government represented in the UNGA, which is a Myanmar seat held by someone who is staunchly opposed to the junta. And this is essentially possible because of China being a part of the Credentials Committee and has not objected to that. We've also heard the Bangladesh Army Chief make statements that China can play a very important role when it comes to resolving the Rohingya crisis, which is another huge crisis, something that Bangladesh bears the brunt for. Do you see China becoming a force stabilizer in the region?
No, I think in fact actually China has done something unusual. China has always been very adept at playing both sides, and I think the example that you gave of allowing their PR to the UN to continue as the representative ambassador for Myanmar in the United Nations is a very good example. Similarly, in the north, with the Three Brotherhood Alliance, in many ways they had very strong links with China, and they may not have been able to make the gains and advances that they did without at least tacit Chinese help, if not help, at least turning a blind eye. And today what we are seeing is a startling change in China's policy, where it is actually shedding the kind of studied ambiguity that it has had vis-a-vis both the center and opposition, and openly taking sides with the Myanmar military junta, the SAC, and backing their political roadmap to come out of this crisis, which is, as you said, the census and the elections. And so this is a little unusual. And as a result of which, China is openly backing now, an entirely unpopular junta. A junta that is probably not wanted, even if the fighting doesn't show 90%, not wanted by about 90% of that population. So in fact, China risks cornering itself politically in Myanmar, and it may be
where it is very heavily invested, though,
when
it comes to infrastructure.
When it comes to infrastructure, investments in mining, in energy, huge connectivity projects which they are doubling upon, real estate. You have oil and gas terminals in Chofu. They have a deep sea port that they want to build up there. They have a concession for a special economic zone there. They have huge investments in the areas towards the north of Myanmar, which are contiguous with Yunnan. They want to have a railway and other connectivity projects. So huge investments, and I think it's these two kinds of investments: the economic investments, which cover a whole series, and the strategic investment that it has made in reaching out to the Bay of Bengal through the CMEC, the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, and the special economic zone, gas and oil pipelines, and now the deepwater harbor port that they are planning there. So it's maybe these interests that are driving their backing. So big countries like China and perhaps India also, they have a tendency to look for one centralizing strong force that can stabilize the whole country. And I think China is making that kind of bet that the junta will be able to enforce and stabilize Myanmar, and that its investments, both strategic as well as economic, will be secure as a result of this. I feel that China is making a mistake. 2024-25 is not the same as what happened in 1988 and 1990s. At that time, as you remember, we had taken a very pro-democracy step, and then had to regret because the junta really came back to power, and then we had to walk back the talk a little and make our relations with the ruling regime at that point. I think that change has now occurred and it's gone. I don't think Myanmar will ever be able to go back to that past, and therefore what we have to do is to prepare for a new future. A new future which is uncertain, unclear. I gave you some directions of it, but in my view, going back to the 2008 constitution is now out, and it'll have to be a new Myanmar. And I think the right policy for countries like India is to prepare themselves and even perhaps help bring about a new equilibrium. New equilibrium that will not be so centralized, which will be a much more federal, decentralized setup.
But every time India says that, we need, of course, negotiations with engagement with all stakeholders to lead to a Myanmar-led and a Myanmar-owned resolution. With Aung San Suu Kyi, of course, Indians had a long-standing relationship, but then there was an entire phase of disappointment also, even talks globally about how she didn't live up to her Nobel Peace Prize. Should India still stay invested in sort of, backing a Suu Kyi as an opposition face, or is India perhaps engaged with the rebel forces? Who is really the sort of political voices that India should be dealing with at this point in time?
So, we are in somewhat not uncharted territory. There is, so to say, a putative national unity government, and which is not, as strongly on the ground as may be required, but we are also dealing with a whole number of players who are represented in things like the National Union Consultative Council. There's the Three Brotherhood Alliance. If we look at our own border, Rakhine State, Bay of Bengal, south of, adjacent to Bangladesh, south of Mizoram, is almost entirely now taken over by the Rakhine. In Chin State, about 85% of the territory of Chin State is now held by the CNF, the Chin National Forces, or the Chin Brotherhood Alliance. So the Chin's also mostly out. In the area of Sagaing, which is the largest province, heartland of Burma, extending practically up to Mandalay, you have the Sagaing Forum. And towards the north, you have the Kachins and a couple of other, smaller kind of outfits. So even in our border, we are never going to be able to, at least for some time to come, we won't have one centralized force to deal with. And the rest of the country will be very similar. It will be. At the same time, the important thing is that almost none of these entities are actually seeking independence. None of them would be very comfortable with the idea of handling everything by themselves. They all need each other. So they are all actually grappling for a formula that can keep them together, as well as respect the autonomy that they have either earned in the past or that they have earned now. And at the same time, many of them would also be seeking to deepen their democracy. See, something that people don't realize is that, Myanmar, when it fought for its independence, it was a very shallow struggle. Effectively, what we had was the 30 comrades who had gone for training initially to wanted to go to China, but they were, picked up by the Japanese first, and who came and behind the Japanese army to so-called liberate Burma. And eventually, at the end of the war, when Burma lost, switched sides and brought the British back and liberated Burma. But there was no mass struggle, there was no people's struggle, there was no popular struggle in the manner that it happened in India, and they didn't have a mass leader like we had in Mahatma Gandhi. They didn't have a political party like we had in the Indian National Congress that fought for a popular struggle. What happened was that you had a vanguard army that switched sides, and after independence came to power. Of course, there were, UNO became the prime minister for the first 10-12 years. You had a democratic government, but at the first strains, mainly coming from the ethnic challenge in the hills, they switched to a military dictatorship. So this movement that we are seeing today is simultaneously a liberation movement, a freedom movement, like we had during our independence struggle, and an internal revolution where they are rejecting military rule in favor of democracy and federalism. So I think these are, if we grasp this, then we realize that this is not just a motley bag of rebels. These are rebels with a cause, with a political vision, with a political platform. And what has been hard for them is that simply they have not had the habit of working together.
Right.
And this is going to be, and they were forced to work together under centralized military administration, and they're going to have to learn to work together.
Just the last 2-3 questions in the India context. Coming to the Rohingya issue, how do you look at how India has approached the issue? The bulk of the Rohingya refugees are in Bangladesh with very little international support, so to say. They've really in India we see so much of politics happening on whatever little number of Rohingyas we may have, particularly now that Delhi is heating up for the elections. Every party is raising it up as an issue. Do you think India should have done more? Could it have pulled more weight on the Rohingya issue, or what India did is what it could have done to the best of its
No, I think
ability?
Personally I think the Rohingyas have been used as purely political football. A kind of minority community that can at the same time be considered foreigners, and therefore in double jeopardy, much the same way as they suffered in Myanmar itself. And what is 50,000? A country like India took 10 million refugees during the Bangladesh crisis. We have taken much larger numbers of refugees from Tibet, from the crisis in Sri Lanka in terms of Tamils. So I think numbers is really not the issue. Whether it is today talking about the odd 40,000 Chin refugees, mostly temporary, by the way, or the Rohingya refugees. 50,000 is not a big number, but it has been a very convenient community to tag and to use for political purposes. Again, people don't realize, the Rohingyas are intrinsically pro-India because as a minority community, and as a community that was perhaps the last outpost, of Muslim role in India, their identification with the periods of, their greatest achievement and glory is with India. And if we had taken, let's say, a more proactive and helpful role, then we could have shamed all the Islamic countries and the West, which talk in the name of human rights, in the name of refugees, but actually don't do much. And we could have not only shamed, we could have set an example to be able to accommodate small numbers in different countries and ameliorate at least the condition of one of the most hapless people in the world. So I think 50,000 is not a big number. We are making just a political issue for our own interests, whichever party does that. And it's at the expense of among the poorest and the least protected people in our region, who have no godfathers at all. Having said that, there is a new trend that has come up. As you know, the Rohingyas had always organized themselves in a number of groupings. One was called the RSO, the Rohingya Salvation Organization. But in the context of what is happening in Rakhine, there is clear evidence of probable, most probable external assistance to prop up now what has assistance from the junta itself. The military junta itself has backed these extremist Rohingya organizations in order to quell whom they conducted the massive ethnic cleansing that people also call a genocide in Myanmar in 2017. The same people are now being used by the junta against the Arakan army. And there are 4 forces that have now recently got together in a kind of Rohingya Islamic front, who probably also have some external support. I can't elaborate on that, but they are a major challenge to the Rohingya, to the Arakan army at a time when the Arakan army is actually winning against the junta. So I would say that, having said what I said about the Rohingya earlier, I would say that there is also an Islamic radical challenge emanating from there, which includes the area of Cox's Bazar and southeastern Bangladesh. What we don't know is whether this is going to be limited to that area, the Rakhine area, or whether it is going to have a larger ramification. In general, if we've seen one trend among radical Islamic forces, partly as a result of the war on terror, is that global jihadism has taken a bit of a backseat for national jihadism. So what we've seen in Taliban in Afghanistan is a kind of Islam in one country, in my country. Same we are seeing with Al-Julani in Syria. And it could be the same in this area as well. But, this is a dynamic process, and these things could go either way. So I think there are dangers as well as overreaction. That
absolutely, of course, there are just so many games and so many moves that is happening in a country like Myanmar and also in the region. Just the last 2 questions then, in terms of India's approach now vis-a-vis what's happening in Manipur and the ethnic nationalities that are shared between Mizoram and the Chin state, and you saw the free movement regime that India had for Myanmar that was ended in January 2024, which was one of the key, in fact, pillars of the Act East policy. And then starting from this year in Jan, we are now seeing basically the Myanmarese nationals in the Indo-Myanmar Friendship Bridge with Mizoram. They need passes now to come in and prove basically that they live within 10 kilometers of the fencing area. Earlier, if I'm not mistaken, it used to be 16 kilometers. And there's complete chaos now because these pass issuing authorities are also missing on the Myanmarese side. So in the Indian side, of course, this is the directive of the Union Home Ministry. How do you look at India looking at its, constructing its Manipur problem, saying that this is because of insurgents operating from Myanmar and trying to fence borders, whether it's Mizoram, whether it's Manipur? Is this a right approach?
No, I think it's totally misguided. But before I'd written a piece about this in the Deccan Herald about a year back, but I'll elaborate on that a little. But before I do that, let me just respond in full to the first part of your question, which I didn't attend to earlier, about China and India. So one of the things that we are seeing is that China has cornered itself into a very unpopular corner vis-a-vis Myanmar and the Myanmar public, particularly by coming out in open support of the junta. At the same time, I think India took a very interesting initiative by inviting not only the junta and allied parties, but also some of the opposition groups to India for essentially a kind of, overture and establishing a kind of groundwork for future discussions. I think it's a sign that India recognizes that things are changing in Myanmar, and in fact the statements that have also been coming in have been in support of transition to a federal democratic union. So I think this is very positive. India is actually diplomatically positioning itself in a very favorable position vis-a-vis China right now. And at the same time, we have seen that in the ASEAN circuit, a country like Thailand has taken the initiative for the first time of bringing together Myanmar's neighbors. So there were 2 meetings in December, or I think in December, in Thailand, which were of this nature, and India was part of it. So was Bangladesh, China, Thailand naturally. I think Laos was also there as a neighbor. So, and now Malaysia is going to take over the chair of the ASEAN. So ASEAN process itself has been totally paralyzed, outdated, and hasn't sort of moved anywhere. So there is a chance for ASEAN now to take a kind of ASEAN plus approach, which is ASEAN plus the immediate neighbors. China is already playing a kind of oversized role, whether it's a neighbor or it's even though it's not part of ASEAN. So here is an opportunity for the countries of the region who are most affected by refugees, conflict, spillovers, etc., to get together and come to some kind of solution to Myanmar. But to the question that you just asked, now this has become a very complicated problem. If you see this area, we have a conflict, totally self-created conflict in Manipur, in my view. You have, a regime change and instability, and some anti-India sentiments, and you have also a degree of Islamic kind of fundamentalist approaches, in Bangladesh. You have in Rakhine the Arakan army virtually taking over the whole state, the junta in the back seat, likely to move further in offensive. You have internal problems in Rakhine between the Rohingya, assisted from the Bangladesh side into Rakhine. In Chittagong hill tracts, you have a 3-cornered problem between the tribals, the Chakma, and the Bangladesh army representing, the Muslim majority that wants to, demographically change the situation in the Chittagong hill tracts. You have signs. You have, of course, the problems in Chin state with the junta, but you also have frictions between the Chin Brotherhood Alliance and the Chin National Front, and you have also Arakan army taking sides in this particular conflict. And on the midst of all this, we are trying to bring in issues like FMR and border fencing. So one of the problems with this border fencing, 2 problems that I would particularly point out, is quite apart from the fact that it is totally going against 200 years of history, starting from the time 1826 when the boundary was as a result of the Yandabo agreement, the boundaries were drawn. Is the fact that, left to itself, India exerts the strongest gravitational force in these areas around, so that if at all there is heightened instability in Myanmar, in Chin state, in Arakan, these states or these ethnicities would be looking to India for protection, for supplies, for humanitarian assistance, for medical,
just to come and buy groceries,
just to simply buy civil supplies. So by doing border fencing, by lifting the FMR, you are actually going to be inhibiting this. But the second thing is even more dangerous, which is, the FMR, the reality was that before boundaries were drawn, communities, the same kith and kin, lived on both sides of the border. They were there even before borders came. People act as though borders are sacrosanct, but in fact populations preceded these borders. And the only reason why many of the ethnic populations, tribal populations, accepted this border was because it was a soft border. So for example, in Nagaland, among the Naga tribes, in Manipur, among both the Naga tribes and the Kuki-Zo tribes who have kith and kin on both sides, in Mizoram, amongst the Mizo and Chin, this is a major irritant. Now, the problem with lifting the FMR and fixing hard frontiers where there were none, where there were soft borders, is that tomorrow this will actually stimulate revanchist tendencies. So people will on this side will claim, no, we are one people and this is our land and we will want to grab their land, and vice versa. People from the other side may say, no, this is the territories in India also belongs to them. So you're opening up borders, and that I don't think, given the tumult that is undergoing here, sectarian, tribal, political,
it's the last thing
majoritarian, this is literally, like stirring a beehive in a very, very so I feel that I'm not sure. I think in India there's a tendency of looking at these things excessively from the communal angle. So if we look at the problem in Rakhine, we'll look at it as a Muslim versus Buddhist. I think that is the wrong way to go. That is not the way people in Myanmar are looking at it, and that will drive us into a tunnel from which we will have more problems than we already have right now.
So just in conclusion, if you could tell me your comments briefly. Avinash Paliwal, who's a scholar in the UK, and in his recent book India's Nearest, it's a good recommendation to read about what's happening in India's northeast and Bangladesh. He writes that despite the aspirational rhetoric of connectivity and realities of India's regional power, there are limits to what New Delhi can do to reshape the strategic environment in this region. Do you agree with this?
I think Avinash has written a very good book, and I'm a big fan of the book. I think our problem is lack of confidence. I don't think it is lack of ability. I think if we really realize that we have strengths, economic strengths, the strength of our soft power, but even more than that, the soft power of our political system, which is actually not a soft power, it's a kind of hard power. People look up to us in this area. We were the original federal democratic country. Myanmar today is looking for a federal democratic solution to its problems. We are the natural role model for this. We should have the skills, the capabilities, the expertise, even the political expertise, because we know and understand democracy, how to go about this, to be able to play a much larger role. If the Myanmar had to look around, where would they turn to? Would they turn to monolithic, countries like, say, China? Would they turn to distant powers like Russia or the United States for their models? Their models is readily available here. So I just think that it's not that we don't have the ability, but we lack the confidence. We lack the belief in ourselves to be able to do this. And of course, this belief also has to be nourished. There was a time we were playing an active political role in many parts of the world. I think we have tended to fall back on that, and that has something to do with the fact that we are being, in some ways being less and less of a democracy. Our belief in ourselves has gone down, so we cannot play that role outside of ourselves either.
I think that's a very important note to end this conversation with. It was an attempt to try and make sense of what's happening in Myanmar, something that's not being talked about too much, at least in the mainstream media space. So thank you so much,
My pleasure, Smita. Thank you for an expansive interview.
Right, and I hope that if you like this content, do share it, subscribe to the station, and make sure to press the bell icon notification so you know when I upload fresh content and we live stream. Thanks for watching. Goodbye and take care.